Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of American Civil War Figures. In this Beat 9400 podcast episode, I will be discussing the life and career of Union General William Tecumseh Sherman and his impact upon the eventual outcome of the 4-year long conflict that ultimately resulted in the Confederate Rebellion's surrender. I hope you enjoy, and please subscribe. William Tecumseh Sherman was born in 1820 in Lancaster, Ohio, near the banks of the Hocking River. His father, Charles Robert Sherman, a lawyer who was a justice on the Ohio Supreme Court, died unexpectedly of typhoid fever in 1829. He left his widow, Mary Hoyt Sherman, with 11 children and no inheritance. After his father's death, the 9-year-old Sherman was raised by a Lancaster neighbor and family friend attorney, Thomas Ewing. Ewing was a prominent member of the Whig Party who became a United States Senator for Ohio and the first Secretary of the Interior. Sherman was distantly related to U.S. founding father Roger Sherman. Sherman's older brother, Charles Taylor Sherman, became a federal judge. One of his younger brothers, John Sherman, was one of the founders of the Republican Party and served as a U.S. congressman, senator, and cabinet secretary. Another younger brother, Hoyt Sherman, was a successful banker. Two of his foster brothers served as major generals in the Union Army during the Civil War. Hugh Boyle Ewing, later an ambassador and author, and Thomas Ewing Jr., who was a defense attorney in the military trials of the Lincoln conspirators. Sherman's given names. Sherman's unusual given name has always attracted attention. According to Sherman's memoirs, he was named William Tecumseh, his father having caught a fancy for the great chief of the Shawnees Tecumseh, a Native American Indian tribe. However, Lloyd Lewis's 1932 biography claimed that Sherman was originally named only Tecumseh and that he acquired the name William at the age of 9 or 10 when he was baptized as a Catholic at the behest of his foster family. According to Lewis's account, he was repeated by later authors. Sherman was baptized in the Ewing house by a Dominican priest who found the pagan name Tecumseh unsuitable and instead named the child William, after the saint on whose feast day the baptism took place. Sherman had already been baptized as an infant by a Presbyterian minister, and recent biographers believe, contrary to Lewis's claims, that he was probably given the first name William at that time. As an adult, Sherman signed all his correspondence, including to his wife, W.T. Sherman. His friends and family called him Cump. Military training and service. Senator Ewing secured an appointment for the 16-year-old Sherman as a cadet in the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York. Sherman roomed with, and befriended another important future Civil War general for the Union, George H. Thomas. Sherman excelled academically at West Point, but he treated the demerit system with indifference. Fellow cadet William Rosecrans remembered Sherman as one of the brightest and most popular fellows at the Academy, and as a bright-eyed, red-headed fellow who was always prepared for a lark of any kind. About his time at West Point, Sherman says only the following in his memoirs. At the Academy, I was not considered a good soldier, for at no time was I selected for any office, but remained a private throughout the whole 4 years. Then, as now, neatness in dress and form were strict conformity to the rules, were the qualifications required for office, and I suppose I was found not to excel in any of these. In studies, I always held a respectable reputation with the professors, and generally ranked among the best, especially in drawing, chemistry, mathematics, and natural philosophy. My average demerits per annum were about 150, which reduced my final class standing from number 4 to 6. Upon graduation in 1840, Sherman entered the Army as a second lieutenant in the 3rd U.S. Artillery and saw action in Florida in the Second Seminole War. In his memoirs, he noted that it was a great pity to remove the Seminoles at all, as Florida was the Indians' paradise and still had, at that time, Sherman wrote in his memoirs in the 1870s, a population less than should make a good state. Sherman was later stationed in Georgia and South Carolina As the foster son of a prominent Whig politician in Charlestown, the popular Lieutenant Sherman moved within the upper circles of Old South society. While many of his colleagues saw action in the Mexican-American Civil War, Sherman was assigned to the administrative duties in the captured territory of California, along with fellow lieutenants Henry Halleck and Edward Ord. Sherman embarked from New York City on the 198-day journey around Cape Horn aboard the converted sloop USS Lexington. During that voyage, Sherman grew close to Ord and especially to the intellectually distinguished Halleck. In his memoirs, Sherman relates a hike with Halleck to the summit of Corcovado overlooking Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, South America, in order to examine the city's aqueduct design. Sherman and Ord disembarked in Monterey, California on the 28th of January 1847, 2 days before the town of Yerba Buena acquired the new name of San Francisco. Sherman and Halleck lived in a house in Monterey known as Sherman Quarters from 1847 to 1849. In June of 1848, Sherman accompanied the military governor of California, Colonel Richard Barnes Mason, to inspect the gold mines at Sutter's Fort. Sherman unwittingly helped to launch the California gold rush by drafting the original documents in which Governor Mason confirmed that gold had been discovered in the region. He also opened a general store in Coloma, which earned him $1,500 in 1849, while his army salary was only a mere $70 a month. Sherman also owned money from surveying and by the sale of lots in Sacramento and Benicia, even though he earned a brevet promotion to captain in 1848 for his meritorious service. His lack of combat experience and relatively slow advancement within the army discouraged him. Sherman would eventually become one of the few high-ranking officers of the United States Civil War who had not fought in Mexico. Marriage and business career. On the 1st of May 1850, Sherman married his foster sister, Ellen Boyle Ewing, who was 4 years and 8 months his junior. Ellen's father, Thomas Ewing, was the United States Secretary of the Interior at that time. Father James A. Ryder, president of Georgetown College, officiated at the Washington, D.C. ceremony. President Zachary Taylor, Vice President Millard Fillmore, and other political luminaries attended the wedding. Ellen Ewing Sherman was a devout Catholic, and the couple's children were reared in that faith. Their children were the following: Maria Ewing, nicknamed Minnie, born 1851, died 1913. Mary Elizabeth, born 1852, died 1925. William Tecumseh Jr., nicknamed Willie, born 1854, died 1863. Thomas Ewing, born 1856, died 1933. Eleanor Mary, nicknamed Ellie, born 1859, died 1915. Rachel Ewing, born 1861, died 1919. Charles Celestine, born 1864, died 1864. Philemon Tecumseh, born 1867, died 1941. Sherman was appointed as captain in the Army's Commissionary Department on September 27, 1850, with offices located in St. Louis, Missouri, in the Midwest. He resigned his commission in 1853 and entered civilian life as a manager of the San Francisco branch of the Bank of Lucas, Turner and Company, whose corporate headquarters were located in St. Louis, Missouri. Sherman survived 2 shipwrecks and floated through the Golden Gate on the overturned hull of a floundering lumber schooner. Sherman suffered from asthma attacks, where he attributed in part to stress caused by the city's aggressive business culture. Later in life, Sherman said of his time in San Francisco gripped by the frenzy of real estate speculation, "I can handle 100,000 men in battle and take the city of the sun, but I'm afraid to manage a lot in the swamp of San Francisco." The failure of Page, Bacon and Company triggered a panic surrounding the Black Friday of February 23, 1855, leading to the closure of several of San Francisco's principal banks and many other businesses. Sherman, however, succeeded in keeping his own bank solvent. In 1856, during the Vigilante period, he served briefly as Major General of the California Militia. Sherman's San Francisco branch closed in May of 1857 and relocated to New York City on behalf of the same bank, traveling on the steamer SS Central America. When the bank failed during the Panic of 1857, he closed the New York branch. In early 1858, he returned to California to finalize the bank's outstanding accounts there. Later in 1858, he moved to Leavenworth, Kansas, where he worked as an office manager of the law firm established by his brothers-in-law, Hugh Ewing and Thomas Ewing, Jr. Sherman obtained a license to practice law despite not having studied for the bar, but he met with little success as a lawyer. Military College Superintendent. In 1859, Sherman accepted a job as the superintendent of the Louisiana State Seminary of Learning and Military Academy, located in Pineville, Louisiana, a position he sought at the suggestion of Major Don Carlos Buell and obtained through the support of General George Mason Graham. Sherman was an effective and popular leader of the institution, which would later become Louisiana State University. Colonel Joseph P. Taylor, brother of the late President Zachary Taylor, declared that if you had hunted the whole army from one end of it to the other, you could not have found a man in it more admirably suited for the position in every respect than Sherman. Sherman's younger brother John was from his seat in the United States Congress a prominent advocate against slavery. Before the Civil War, however, the more conservative William T. had expressed some sympathy for the white Southerners' defense of the traditional agrarian system, including the institution of slavery. On the other hand, he was adamantly opposed to the secession of the Southern states. In Louisiana, he became a close friend of Professor David French Boyd, a native of Virginia and an enthusiastic secessionist. Boyd later recalled witnessing that when news of South Carolina's secession from the United States reached them at the seminary, Sherman burst out crying and began in his nervous way, pacing the floor and deprecating the step which he feared might bring destruction on the whole country. In what some authors have seen as an accurate prophecy of the conflict that would engulf the United States during the next four years, Boyd recalled Sherman declaring, "You people of the South don't know what you are doing. This country will be drenched in blood, and God only knows how it will end. It is all folly, madness, a crime against civilization. You people speak so lightly of war. You don't know what you're talking about. War is a terrible thing. You mistake too. The people of the North, they are a peaceable people, but an earnest people, and they will fight too. They are not going to let this country be destroyed without a mighty effort to save it. Besides, where are your men and appliances of war to contend against them? The North can make a steam engine, locomotive, or railway car. Hardly a yard of cloth or pair of shoes can you make. You are rushing into war with one of the most powerful, ingeniously mechanical, and determined people on earth right at your doors. You are bound to fail. Only in your spirit and determination are you prepared for war. In all else, you are totally unprepared, with bad cause to start with. At first, you will make headway, but as your limited resources begin to fail, shut out from the markets of Europe as you will be, your cause will begin to wane. If your people will but stop and think, they must see in the end that you will surely fail." In January 1861, as more Southern states seceded from the Union, Sherman was required to take receipt of arms surrendered to the Louisiana State Militia by the United States Arsenal at Baton Rouge. Instead of complaining, he resigned his position as superintendent, declaring to the governor of Louisiana that on no earthly account will I act or think any thought hostile to or in the defense of the old government of the United States of America. St. Louis Interlude. Sherman departed Louisiana and had traveled to Washington, D.C., possibly in the hope of securing a position in the United States Army. At the White House, Sherman met with President Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, a few days after his inauguration as the President of the United States. Sherman expressed grave concerns about the North's poor state of preparedness for the looming Civil War, but he found Lincoln unresponsive. Sherman then moved to St. Louis to become president of a streetcar company called the Fifth Street Railroad. Thus, he was living in the border state of Missouri as the succession crisis reached its climax. While trying to hold himself aloof from politics, he observed firsthand the efforts of Congressman Frank Blair, who later served under Sherman in the United States Army to keep Missouri in the Union. In early April, Sherman declared Montgomery's Blair offer of the administrative position of chief clerk in the War Department, despite Blair's promise that it would be followed by nomination as Assistant Secretary of War after the U.S. Congress assembled in July. After April the 12th to the 13th, bombardment of Fort Sumter and its subsequent capture by the Confederacy, Sherman hesitated about committing to military service. He privately ridiculed Lincoln's call for 75,000 Fremont volunteers to quell secession, reportedly saying, "Why, you might as well attempt to put out the flames of a burning house with a squirt gun." In May, however, he offered himself for service in the regular army. Senator John Sherman, his youngest brother and a political ally of President Lincoln and other connections in Washington, helped him to obtain a commission. On June 3rd, he wrote in a letter to his brother-in-law, "I think it is still to be a long war, very long, much longer than any politician thinks." Civil War service, first commissions, and Bull Run. General Sherman was first commissioned as colonel of the 13th U.S. Infantry Regiment, effective on the 14th of May, 1861. This was a new regiment yet to be raised. In fact, Sherman's first command was a brigade of Fremont volunteers who fought in the First Battle of the Bull Run on July 21st, 1861. It was one of the 4 brigades in the division commanded by General Daniel Taylor, which is in turn one of the 5 divisions in the Army of Northeastern Virginia under General Irvin McDowell. The engagement at Bull Run ended in a disastrous defeat for the Union, dashing the hopes for a rapid succession of the conflict over secession. Sherman was one of the few Union officers to distinguish himself in the field, and historian Donald L. Miller has characterized Sherman's performance at Bull Run as exemplary. Despite the fighting, Sherman was grazed by bullets in the knee and shoulder. According to British military historian Brian Holden Reid, if Sherman had committed tactical errors during the attack, he more than compensated for these during the subsequent retreat. Holden Reid also concluded that Sherman might have been as unseasoned as the men he commanded, but he had not fallen prey to the naive illusions nursed by so many on the field of first Bull Run. The outcome at Bull Run caused Sherman to question his own judgment as an officer and the capabilities of his volunteer troops. However, Sherman impressed Lincoln during the president's visit to the troops on July 23rd, and Lincoln promoted Sherman to Brigadier General of Volunteers, effective May 17, 1861. This made Sherman senior in rank to Ulysses S. Grant, his future commander. Sherman was then assigned to serve under Robert Anderson in the Department of the Cumberland, located in Louisville, Kentucky. In October, Sherman succeeded Anderson in command of that department. In his memoirs, Sherman would later write that he saw his new assignment as breaking a promise by President Lincoln that he would not be given such a prominent leadership position. Kentucky and breakdown. Having succeeded Anderson at Louisville, Sherman now had principal military responsibility for Kentucky, a border state in which the Confederates held Columbus and Bowling Green, and were also present near the Cumberland Gap. He became exceedingly pessimistic about the outlook for his command, and he complained frequently to Washington about shortages, while providing exaggerated estimates of the strength of the rebel forces and requesting inordinate numbers of reinforcements. Critical press reports about Sherman began to appear after the U.S. Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, visited Louisville in October of 1861. In early November, Sherman asked to be relieved of his command. He was promptly replaced by Don Carlos Bell and transferred to St. Louis, Missouri. In December, he was put on leave by Henry W. Halleck, commander of the Department of the Missouri, who found him unfit for duty and sent him to Lancaster, Ohio, to recuperate. While he was at home, his wife Ellen wrote to his brother, Senator John Sherman, seeking advice and complaining of that melancholy insanity to which your family is subject. In his private correspondence, Sherman later wrote that the concerns of command broke me down and admitted to having contemplated suicide. His problems were compounded when the Cincinnati Commercial described him as insane. By mid-December 1861, Sherman had recovered sufficiently to return to service under Halleck in the Department of the Missouri. In March, Halleck's command was redesignated the Department of the Mississippi and enlarged to unify command in the West. Sherman's initial assignments were re-echelon commands, first of an instructional barracks near St. Louis and in the command of the District of Cairo. Operating from Paducah, Kentucky, he provided logistical support for the operations of Grant to capture Fort Donelson. In February 1862, Grant, the previous commander of the District of Cairo, had just won a major victory at Fort Henry and had been given command of the ill-defined District of West Tennessee. Although Sherman was technically the senior officer, he wrote to Grant, "I feel anxious about you, as I know the great facilities the Confederates have of concentration by means of the river and railroad, but I have faith in you. Command me in any way." Shiloh. After Grant captured Fort Donelson, Sherman got his wish to serve under Grant when he was assigned on the 1st of March 1862 to the Army of West Tennessee as commander of the 5th Division. His first major test under Grant was at the Battle of Shiloh. The massive Confederate attack on the morning of April 6, 1862, took most of the senior Union commanders by surprise. Sherman had dismissed the intelligence reports from militia officers, refusing to believe that Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston would leave his base at Corinth. He took no precautions beyond strengthening his picket lines and refused to entrench, build abatis, or push out reconnaissance patrols. At Shiloh, he may have wished to avoid appearing overly alarmed in order to escape the kind of criticism he had received in Kentucky. Indeed, he had written to his wife that if he took more precautions, they'd call me crazy again. With a heavy rain coming down at the end of the first day of fighting at Shiloh, Sherman came upon Grant standing under a large oak tree, his cigar glowing in the darkness. Heeding, he would say, some wise and sudden instinct not to mention retreat, he made a non-committal remark. "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" "Yes," Grant replied, puffing on his cigar. "Look him tomorrow, though." Despite being unprepared by the attack, Sherman rallied his division and conducted an orderly fighting retreat that helped avert a disastrous Union rout. Sherman proved instrumental to mounting the successful Union counterattack of the following day, April 2nd of 1862. At Shiloh, Sherman was wounded twice in the hand and shoulder and had 3 horses shot out from under him. His performance was praised by Grant and Halleck, and after the battle he was promoted to Major General of Volunteers, effective the 1st of May, 1862. The success contributed greatly to raising Sherman's spirits and changing his personal outlook on the Civil War and his role in it. According to Sherman's biographer, Robert O'Connell, Shiloh marked the turning point of his life. In late April, a Union force of 100,000 men, under Halleck's leadership with Grant, regulated to second in command, began advancing slowly against Corinth. Sherman commanded the division on the extreme right of the Union's right wing under George Henry Thomas. Shortly after the Union forces occupied Corinth on May 30th, Sherman persuaded Grant not to resign from his command, despite the serious difficulties he was having with Halleck. Sherman offered Grant an example from his own life. "Before the Battle of Shiloh, I was cast down by a mere newspaper assertion of crazy, but that single battle gave me new life, and I'm now in high favor." He told Grant that if he remained in the army, some happy accident might restore you to favor and your true place. In July, Grant's situation improved when Halleck left for the East to become General-in-Chief. Sherman then became the military governor of occupied Memphis, Tennessee. Vicksburg. In November of 1862, Grant, acting as commander of the Union forces in the state of Mississippi, launched a campaign to capture the city of Vicksburg, the principal Confederate stronghold along the Mississippi River. Grant made Sherman a corps commander and put him in charge of his forces. According to historian John D. Winters, the Civil War in Louisiana, at this stage, Sherman had yet to display any marked talents for leadership. Sherman, beset by hallucinations and unreasonable fears, and finally contemplating suicide, had been relieved from command in Kentucky. He later became a new climb to success at Shiloh and Corinth under Grant. Still, if he muffed his Vicksburg assignment, which began unfavorably, he would rise no higher. As a man, Sherman was often a eccentric mixture of strength and weakness. Although he was impatient, often irritable and depressed, petulant, headstrong, and unreasonably gruff, he had solid soldierly qualities. His men swore by him, and most of his fellow officers admired him. In December, Sherman's forces suffered a severe repulse at the Battle of Chickasaw Bayou, just north of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Sherman's operations were supposed to be coordinated with an advance on Vicksburg by Grant from another direction. Unbeknownst to Sherman, Grant abandoned his advance, and Sherman's river expedition met more resistance than expected. Soon after, Major General John A. McClernand ordered Sherman's corps to join his assault on Arkansas Post. Grant, who was on poor terms with McClernand, regarded this as a politically motivated distraction from the efforts to take Vicksburg, but Sherman had targeted Arkansas Post independently and considered the operation worthwhile. Arkansas Post was subsequently taken by the Union Army and Navy on the 11th of January, 1863. The failure of the first phase of the campaign against Vicksburg led Grant to formulate an unorthodox new strategy, which called for the invading Union Army to separate from its supply train and subsist by foraging. Sherman initially expressed reservations about the wisdom of these plans, but he soon submitted to Grant's leadership in the campaign. In the spring of 1863, submitted Sherman's personal ties to Grant. The bulk of Grant's forces were now organized into three corps. Under General McClernand, the corps under Sherman, and the corps under Sherman's young protege, Major General James B. McPherson. During the long and complicated maneuvers against Vicksburg, one newspaper complained that the army was being ruined in mid-turtle expeditions under the leadership of a drunkard. Grant, whose confidential advisor Sherman, was a lunatic. When Vicksburg fell on July 4, 1863, after a prolonged siege, the Union achieved a major strategic victory, putting navigation along the Mississippi River entirely under Union control and effectively cutting off the western half of the Confederacy from the eastern half. During the siege of Vicksburg, Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston had gathered a force of 30,000 men in Jackson, Mississippi, with the intention of relieving the garrison under the command of John C. Pemberton that was trapped inside Vicksburg. After Pemberton surrendered to Grant on July the 4th, Johnston advanced towards the rear of Grant's forces. In response to his threat, Grant instructed Sherman to attack Johnston. Sherman conducted the ensuing Jackson expedition, which concluded successfully on July 25th with the recapture of the city of Jackson. This helped ensure that the Mississippi River would remain in Union hands for the remainder of the war. According to Holden Reed, Sherman finally had cut his teeth as an army commander with the Jackson expedition. Chattanooga. After the surrender of Vicksburg and the recapture of Jackson, Sherman was given the rank of brigadier general in the regular army in addition to his rank as a major general of volunteers. His family traveled from Ohio to visit him at the camp near Vicksburg. Sherman's 9-year-old son Willie, the little sergeant, died from typhoid fever contracted during the trip. Ordered to relieve the Union forces besieged in the city of Chattanooga, Tennessee, Sherman departed from Memphis on October 11, 1863, aboard a train bound for Chattanooga. When Sherman's train passed Collierville, it came under attack by 3,000 Confederate cavalry and 8 guns under James Ronald Chalmers. Sherman took command of the infantrymen in the local Union garrison and successfully repelled the Confederate attack. Following the defeat of the Army of the Cumberland at the Battle of Chickamauga by Confederate General Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee, President Lincoln reorganized the Union forces in the West as the military division of the Mississippi, placing it under General Grant's command. Sherman then succeeded Grant at the head of the Army of Tennessee. At Chattanooga, Grant instructed Sherman to attack the right flank of Bragg's forces, which entrenched along Missionary Ridge overlooking the city. On November 25th, Sherman took his assigned target of Billy Goat Hill at the north end of the ridge, only to find that it was separated from the main spine by a rock-strewn ravine. When he attempted to attack the main spine of Tunnel Hill, his troops were repelled by Patrick Cleburne's heavy division, the best unit in Bragg's army. Grant then ordered Thomas to attack at the center of the Confederate line. This frontal assault was intended as a diversion, but it unexpectedly succeeded in capturing the enemy's entrenchments and routing the Confederate Army of Tennessee, bringing the Union's Chattanooga campaign to a successful completion. After Chattanooga, Sherman led a column to relieve Union forces under Ambrose Burnside, fought to be in peril at Knoxville. In February 1864, he commanded an expedition to Meridian, Mississippi, intended to disrupt Confederate infrastructure and communications. Sherman's army captured the city of Meridian on the 14th of February and proceeded to destroy 105 miles of railroad and 61 bridges, while burning at least 10 locomotives and 28 rail cars. The army took 4,000 prisoners and commanded many wagons and horses. Thousands of refugees, both black and white, joined Sherman's columns, which on February 20th finally withdrew towards Canton. Atlanta. The Meridian campaign marked the end of Sherman's brief tenure as commander of the Army of Tennessee. Sherman had up to that point achieved mixed success as a general, and controversy attached especially to his performance at Chattanooga. However, he enjoyed Grant's confidence and friendship when Lincoln called Grant east in the spring of 1864 to take command of all the Union armies. Grant appointed Sherman, by then known to his soldiers as Uncle Billy, to succeed him as head of the Western Division, as the military division of the Mississippi, which entailed command of Union troops in the western theater of the war. As Grant took overall command of the armies of the United States, Sherman wrote to him outlining his strategy to bring the war to an end. If you can whip Lee and I can march to the Atlantic, I think old Uncle Abe Lincoln will give us 20 days' leave to see the young folks. Sherman proceeded to invade the state of Georgia with three armies: the 60,000-strong Army of the Cumberland under Thomas, the 25,000-strong Army of the Tennessee under James McPherson, and the 13,000-strong Army of the Ohio under John M. Schofield. He conducted a series of flanking maneuvers through rugged terrain against Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston's Army of the Tennessee, attempting a direct assault only at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. The Confederate victory at Kennesaw Mountain did little to halt Sherman's advance towards Atlanta. In July, the cautious Johnson was replaced by the more aggressive John Bell Hood, who played to Sherman's strength by challenging him to direct battles on open ground. Meanwhile, in August, Sherman learned that I had been commissioned a major general in the regular army, which was unexpected and not desired until successful in the capture of Atlanta. Sherman on horseback in September of 1864. Sherman's Atlanta campaign concluded successfully on the 2nd of September 1864 with the capture of the city, which Hood had been forced to abandon. After ordering almost all civilians to abandon the city in September, Sherman gave instructions that all military and government buildings in Atlanta be burned, although many private homes and shops were burned as well. The capture of Atlanta made Sherman a household name and was decisive in ensuring Lincoln's re-election in November. Sherman's success caused the collapse of the once powerful Copperhead faction within the Democratic Party, which had advocated immediate peace negotiations with the Confederacy. It also dealt a major blow to the popularity of the Democratic presidential candidate George B. McClellan, whose victory in the election had until then appeared like too many, including Lincoln himself. According to Holden Reed, Sherman did more than any other man apart from the president in creating the climate of opinion that afforded Lincoln a comfortable victory over McClellan at the polls. March to the Sea. During September and October, Sherman and Hood played a cat-and-mouse game in northern Georgia and Alabama, as Hood threatened Sherman's communications to the north. Eventually, Sherman won approval from his superiors for a plan to cut loose from his communications and march south, having advised Grant that he could make Georgia howl. In response, Hood moved north into Tennessee. Sherman at first trivialized the corresponding threat, reportedly saying that it would give Hood his rations to go in that direction, as my business is down south. Sherman left forces under Major Generals George H. Thomas and John M. Schofield to deal with Hood. Their forces eventually smashed Hood's army in the battles of Franklin, November 30th, and Nashville, December 15th to 16th. After November's elections, Sherman began marching on November 15th with 62,000 men in the direction of the port city of Savannah, Georgia, living off the land and causing, by his own estimate, more than $100 million in property damage. At the end of his campaign, known as Sherman's March of the Sea, his troops took Savannah on December 21st of 1864. Upon reaching Savannah, Sherman appointed Private A. O. Granger as his personal secretary. Sherman then dispatched a message to Lincoln offering the city as a Christmas present. Sherman's success in Georgia received ample coverage in the Northern press at a time when Grant seemed to be making little progress in his fight against Confederate General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. A bill was introduced in Congress to promote General Sherman to Grant's rank of a lieutenant general, probably with a view towards having him replace Grant as commander of the Union Army. Sherman wrote both to his brother, Senator John Sherman, and to General Grant vehemently repudiating any such promotion. According to a wartime account, it was around this time that Sherman made his memorable declaration of loyalty to Grant. General Grant is a great general. I know him well. He stood by me when I was crazy, and I stood by him when he was drunk. And now, sir, we stand by each other always. While in Savannah, Sherman learned from a newspaper that his infant son, Charles Celestine, had died during the Savannah campaign. The general had never seen the child. Final campaign in the Carolinas. Grant then ordered Sherman to embark his army on steamers and join the Union forces confronting Lee in Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, but Sherman instead persuaded Grant to allow him to march north through the Carolinas, destroying everything of military value along the way as he had done in Georgia. He was particularly interested in targeting South Carolina, the first state to secede from the Union because of the effect that it would have on Southern morale. His army proceeded north through South Carolina against light resistance from the troops of Confederate General Johnson. Upon hearing that Sherman's men were advancing on corduroy roads through the Salkehatchie swamps at a rate of 12 miles per day, Johnson made up his mind that there had been no such army in existence since the days of Julius Caesar, the Roman emperor. Sherman captured Columbia, the state capital, on the 17th of February, 1865. Fires began that night, and by the next morning, most of the central city was destroyed. The burning of Columbia was in controversy ever since, with some claiming that fires were a deliberate act of vengeance by the Union troops, and others that the fires were accidental, caused in part by the burning bales of cotton that the retreating Confederates left behind. Local Native American lumber guides helped Sherman's army cross the Lumber River, which was flooded by torrential rains into North Carolina. According to Sherman, the trek across the Lumber River and through the swamps, Pocossins, and the creeks of Robeson County was the damnedest marching I ever saw. Thereafter, his troops had relatively little damage to the civilian infrastructure. North Carolina, unlike its southern neighbor, was regarded by the Union troops as a reluctant Confederate state, having seen second from last to succeed from the Union, ahead only of Tennessee. The only general engagement during Sherman's marches through Georgia and the Carolinas, the Battle of Bentonville, took place on March the 19th through the 21st of 1865. Having defeated the Confederate forces under Johnston at Bentonville, Sherman proceeded to rendezvous at Goldsboro with the Union troops that awaited him there after the capture of the coastal cities of New Bern and Wilmington. In late March, Sherman briefly left his forces and traveled to City Point, Virginia, to confer with Grant. Lincoln happened to be at City Point at the same time, making possible the only freeway meeting of Lincoln, Grant, and Sherman during the war. Also present at the City Point conference was Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter. This meeting was memorialized in GPA Healing's painting The Peacemakers. After returning to Goldsboro, Sherman marched with his troops to the state capital, Raleigh, where Sherman sought to communicate with Johnston's army regarding possible terms for ending the war. On the 9th of April, Sherman relayed to his troops that the news that Lee had surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse and that the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia had ceased to exist. Confederate surrender. Following Lee's surrender and the assassination of President Lincoln, Sherman met with Johnston on the 17th of April, 1865, at Bennett Place in Durham, North Carolina, to negotiate a Confederate surrender. At the insistence of Johnson, Confederate President Jefferson Davis, and Confederate Secretary of War John C. Breckinridge, Sherman conditionally agreed to generous terms that dealt with both military and political issues. On the 20th of April, Sherman dispatched a memorandum with those terms to the government in Washington, D.C. Sherman believed that the terms that he had agreed to were consistent with the views that Lincoln expressed at City Point, and that they offered the best way to prevent Johnson from ordering his men to go into the wilderness and conduct a destructive guerrilla campaign. However, Sherman had proceeded without authority from Grant, the newly installed President Andrew Johnson, or the cabinet. The assassination of President Abraham Lincoln had caused the political climate in Washington, D.C. to turn against the prospect of a rapid reconciliation with the defeated Confederates, and the Johnson administration rejected Sherman's terms. Grant may have had to intervene to save Sherman from dismissal for having overstepped his authority. The U.S. Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton, linked Sherman's memorandum to the New York Times, intimating that Sherman might have been bribed to allow Davis to escape capture by the Union troops. This precipitated a deep and long-lasting enmity between Sherman and Stanton, and intensified Sherman's disdain for politicians. Grant then offered Johnston purely military terms similar to those that he had negotiated with Lee at Appomattox. Johnston, ignoring instructions from President Davis, accepted those terms on April 26, 1865, formally surrendered his army and all the Confederate forces in the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida. This was the largest single capitulation of the war. Sherman proceeded with some of his troops to Washington, where they marched in the Grand Review of the Armies on the 24th of May, 1865. Slavery and Emancipation. General William Tecumseh Sherman was not an abolitionist before the war, and like others of his time in the background, he did not believe in, excuse my language, N-word equality. Before the war, Sherman expressed some sympathy with the view of some whites that the black race was benefiting from slavery, although he opposed breaking up slave families and advocated that laws forbidding the education of slaves be repealed. Throughout the Civil War, Sherman declined to employ black troops in his armies. In his memoirs, Sherman commented on the political pressures of 1864-1865 to encourage the escape of slaves, in part to avoid the possibility that able-bodied slaves would be called into the military service of the rebels. Sherman rejected this, arguing that he would have delayed the successful end of the war and the liberation of all slaves. According to Sherman, my aim then was to whip the rebels, to humble their pride, to follow them to their inmost recess, and make them fear and dread us. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. I did not want them to cast in our teeth what General Hood had once done at Atlanta, that we had to call on their slaves to help us subdue them. Tens of thousands of escaped slaves nonetheless joined Sherman's marches through Georgia and the Carolina as refugees. Their fate soon became a pressing military and political issue. Some abolitionists accused Sherman of doing little to alleviate the precarious living conditions of those refugees, motivating Secretary of War Stanton to travel to Georgia in 1865 to investigate the situation. On January the 12th, Sherman and Stanton met in Savannah, Georgia, with 20 local black leaders, most of them Baptist or Methodist ministers, invited by Sherman. According to historian Eric Fonner, the colloquy between Sherman, Stanton, and the black leaders offered a rare lens through which the experience of slavery and the aspirations that would help to shape Reconstruction came into sharp focus. A family of 30 slaves, After Sherman's departure, the spokesman for the black leaders, Baptist minister Garrison Frazier, declared in response to Stanton's inquiry about the feelings of the black community, "We looked upon General Sherman prior to his arrival as a man in the providence of God, especially set apart to accomplish his work, and we unanimously feel inexpressible gratitude to him, looking upon him as a man that should be honored for the faithful performance of his duty. Some of us called upon him immediately upon his arrival, and it is probable he would not meet the Secretary Stanton with more courtesy than he met us. His conduct and deportment towards us characterized him as a friend and a gentleman." 4 days later, Sherman issued his Special Field Forces Order No. 15. The orders provided for the settlement of 40,000 freed slaves and black refugees on land expropriated from white landowners located in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Sherman appointed Brigadier General Rufus Saxton, an abolitionist from Massachusetts, who had previously directed the recruitment of black soldiers, to implement that plan. Those orders, which became the basis of the claim that the Union government had promised free slaves, 40 acres and a mule, were revoked later that year by President Andrew Johnson, a racist. Towards the end of the Civil War, some elements within the Republican Party regarded Sherman as being strongly prejudiced against black people. Sherman's views on race evolved significantly over time. He dealt in a friendly and unaffected way with the black people that he met during his career. In 1888, near the end of his life, Sherman published an essay in the North American Review defending the full civil rights of black citizens in the former Confederacy. In that essay, Sherman called upon the South to let the, excuse my vote, N-word vote, and count his vote honestly, adding that otherwise, so sure as there is a God in heaven, you will have another war more cruel than the last, when the torch and dagger will take the place of the muskets of well-ordained battalions. Final years. Sherman lived out most of the rest of his life in New York City, New York. He was devoted to the theater and to amateur painting, and was in demand as a colorful speaker at dinners and banquets, in which he indulged a fondness for quoting Shakespeare. During this period, he remained in contact with war veterans, and he was an active member of various social and charitable organizations. Proposed as Republican candidate for the presidential election of 1884, Sherman declared as emphatically as possible, saying, "I will not accept if nominated, and will not serve if elected." As such, a categorical rejection of a candidacy is now referred to as a Shermanesque statement. In 1886, after the publication of Grant's memoirs, Sherman produced a second edition, revised and corrected, of his own memoirs. This new edition, published by Appleton, added a second preface, a chapter about his life up to 1846, a chapter concerning the post-war period, ending with his 1884 retirement from the Army, several appendices, portraits, improved maps, and an index. For the most part, Sherman refused to revise his original text on the ground that I disclaim the character of historian, but assume to be a witness on the stand before the great tribunal of history, and any witness who may disagree with me should publish his own version of the facts in the truthful narration at which he is interested. However, Sherman did not include the views of some others in the appendices of new edition. Death. General William Tecumseh Sherman died of pneumonia in New York City, New York, at 10 to 2 in the afternoon on the 14th of February, 1891, 6 days after his 71st birthday. President Benjamin Harrison, who served under Sherman, sent a telegram to Sherman's family and ordered all national flags to be flown at half-staff. Harrison, in a message to the Senate and the House of Representatives, wrote that he was an ideal soldier and shared to the fullest the esprit de corps of the army, but he cherished the civilian institutions organized under the Constitution, was only a soldier that these might be perpetuated in under diminished usefulness and honor. On February 19th, a funeral service was held at his home, followed by a military procession. Joseph E. Johnson, the Confederate officer who had commanded the resistance to Sherman's troops in Georgia and the Carolinas, served as a pallbearer in New York City. It was a bitterly cold day, and a friend of Johnston, fearing that the general might become ill, asked him to put on his hat. Johnson replied, "If I were in Sherman's place and he were standing in mine, he would not put on his hat." Johnson did catch a serious cold and died 1 month later of pneumonia. Sherman's body was then transported to St. Louis, Missouri, where another service was conducted at a local Catholic church on the 21st of February, 1891. His son, Thomas Ewing Sherman, who was a Jesuit priest, presided over his father's funeral masses in New York City and in St. Louis. Former United States President and Civil War veteran Rutherford B. Hayes, who attended both ceremonies, said at the time that Sherman had been the most interesting and original character in the world. He is buried in Calvary Cemetery in St. Louis, Missouri. That just about concludes another B9400 podcast episode, which I hope you've enjoyed, because there is definitely more to come in the foreseeable future. Please make sure to subscribe. It helps me out considerably in terms of expanding my brand name. I'm signing off. Peace.